She didn't raise her voice. She didn't point fingers. She didn't call names, pound the table, or light up the media with a viral takedown. She just asked one question, 9 words. And for the first time in years, the First Lady of the United States walked out of a federal building without a word, without a schedule, without the strength to pretend she hadn't heard it. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wasn't making headlines that day. She wasn't grandstanding or rallying a crowd. She simply looked a former White House aide in the eye and asked something every American over 50 has either seen or lived through. And when the witness blinked, when the truth cracked the silence, it wasn't Trump who reacted first. It was Melania. Because some questions don't attack. They reveal. They whisper what entire rooms have ignored for far too long. And when that whisper finally hits the heart of power, it doesn't echo. It detonates. This story is a dramatization, inspired by public figures, but fictional in dialogue, timing, and events. But the feelings it touches, fear, love, denial, duty, are very, very real, because behind every policy is a person, behind every silence is someone protecting the one they love, and behind one soft-spoken question was a nation that could no longer look away. Capitol Hill was soaked in a thin, steady rain, the kind that turned polished sidewalks into mirrors and made even the marble steps of Congress feel quiet, reverent, almost reluctant. Inside the Hart Senate office building, fluorescent lights flickered with bureaucratic indifference. It was just another Thursday morning, another subcommittee hearing, another line of forgettable questions on staffing protocols and internal memos that no one outside the room would ever bother to read. The seats weren't full. Cameras, what few there were, panned lazily. Even the interns looked bored, tapping screens under desks, scribbling meaningless notes for superiors who wouldn't read them anyway. That's when she walked in. No entourage, no camera crew, no media alert. Just Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, dressed in slate gray, her hair tucked back, no statement pins, no lipstick headlines. She didn't make eye contact with the crowd. She wasn't here to perform. She was here to listen. The chair at the far end creaked as she took her seat. A few heads turned, almost on instinct. Not because she was expected to speak, but because something about her silence was louder than the room itself. At the witness table sat a man in his early 60s. Nervous fingers toyed with a yellow legal pad. His nameplate read, Robert A. Langford, former senior advisor to the president. He cleared his throat too often, blinked too hard. You could tell he wasn't built for public glare, especially not now, when the country's nerves were already worn thin by rumor and repetition. He had served under President Trump for almost 3 years, mostly off record, mostly invisible, until now. The committee chair, a Republican from Utah, ran through the agenda in a voice so robotic it could have been automated. Most of the room tuned out, already mentally filing this day away as another gray dot in the bureaucratic static. Even the stenographer looked half asleep, but AOC watched, still, unmoving. And when it was her turn to speak, she didn't adjust her microphone. She didn't shuffle papers for effect. She simply looked up and said, "Thank you, Mr. Langford, for being here today." Polite. Director. No warmth, but no venom either. Just presence. He nodded once, a little too quickly. "Yes, Congresswoman." There was a pause, a long one. Long enough that someone in the second row of the public gallery shifted in their seat, waiting for the usual question about staffing charts or security clearances. But what came next wasn't usual. It wasn't on the prepared questions list. AOC leaned forward, just slightly, and asked, "During your time at the White House, were there moments when the president repeated instructions he had already given that same day, contradicted himself, or seemed visibly confused in a way that concerned you?" The room didn't move. It wasn't just the question. It was the way it was asked. Like she already knew the answer, but was offering him the dignity of choosing whether to tell the truth out loud. Langford blinked, once, then again. His lawyer, seated just behind him, leaned forward a fraction, but said nothing. The witness's jaw clenched. He glanced down at his notes as if an answer might be scribbled there. It wasn't. Finally, he cleared his throat and said, "There were moments that raised concern. Yes. It wasn't explosive. It wasn't shouted, but it landed like a tremor. The kind that doesn't crack the floor just yet, but makes everyone freeze and wait for the real quake." AOC didn't smile. She didn't lean in triumphantly or throw her hands up like a pundit at war. She nodded, slow and grave, like someone marking a wound that had just started to show. Then in a voice so calm it somehow carried more weight than outrage ever could, she said, "We all age. That's not shameful. But when a leader begins to slip, when memory becomes a question mark instead of a tool, we as a nation have a duty to ask, not with cruelty, but with clarity." With care, no one spoke. The chair didn't interrupt. The air felt thin, not tense, but honest. Outside, the rain continued falling over D.C., washing down concrete steps like a quiet cleansing. And inside that room, something had shifted. It wasn't visible. It wasn't dramatic, but it was undeniable. No one had ever said it before. Not like that. Not with compassion sharpened into responsibility. And while the cameras were still blinking, and journalists were still blinking, and aides were still blinking, across 1,000 living rooms, phone screens, coffee shop, TVs, and dinner tables, Americans started whispering to each other, "Did you hear what she just asked?" And before the hearing even ended, one video clip, just 26 seconds long, had already begun its journey to reshape the conversation America had been too afraid to have. Because sometimes it only takes one person to ask the question, and sometimes the silence that follows is the answer no one wants, but everyone needed. The pause that followed her question was the kind that didn't need dramatic music or swelling strings. It was the kind that sucked the oxygen out of a room because it forced people to finally sit with what they already suspected. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't framed it as an attack or baited a headline. She simply dropped a mirror in the middle of the room and waited for someone else to admit what they saw. Her tone had been calm, almost surgical, precise, controlled. She had asked, "During your time in the administration, were there moments when the president gave an order, then seemed confused about it later the same day? Repeating it, contradicting it, or forgetting it altogether?" The witness, Robert Langford, blinked twice, then looked down at the legal pad he hadn't written on in over 20 minutes. His lawyer shifted, posture stiffening, one hand hovering like he was about to interject. But he didn't. There was nothing in that question that could be called inappropriate. And that's what made it dangerous. It wasn't loaded. It was lethal in its clarity. Langford's lips parted like he wanted to start with a technicality. Maybe dodge. Maybe redirect. But something, maybe conscience, maybe exhaustion, stopped him. His shoulders, tight and upright, loosened just enough to betray that something was breaking beneath the surface. "There were moments," he said, voice low, gravel thickening his words. "Yes." 3 syllables, but they felt like thunder in a room built on carefully measured silence. No gasps, no slammed fists, no shouting, just that invisible shift, that sudden recalibration in every mind present. The stenographer's pen paused midair. A Republican staffer in the corner straightened in his chair. One camera operator stepped closer instinctively, as if zooming in could help him absorb the gravity of what had just been said. Moments. Moments where the President of the United States, the man with the nuclear codes, the sole authority over national emergency declarations, the face of global American leadership, seemed confused. Moments where his memory bent under pressure. Moments no one dared speak about because saying it meant opening a door that couldn't be closed. AOC didn't gloat. She didn't nod like she'd won something. That wasn't the point. What she did was more powerful than celebration. She let the silence breathe. Let it echo. Let it settle in the ribs of everyone watching like a slow-forming truth. And then, with all the steadiness of someone who understood exactly how fragile this ground was, she said, "We don't talk about this because it's uncomfortable, because we don't want to sound cruel, but ignoring reality doesn't protect dignity, it erodes it. And when that reality involves the most powerful office in the country, then silence is not compassion, it's negligence. That was it. She didn't press further. She didn't try to drag the man into more details or weaponize his statement. She let it stand, like a warning, or maybe an invitation, to others who had been carrying this truth in whispers. What happened next didn't play out in the room, but across the country. In a hospital break room in Detroit, two nurses stopped mid-conversation and stared at the closed captions on CNN. In a small-town barbershop in Alabama, an elderly man reached for the remote and turned the volume up. On TikTok, a young woman spliced the clip with footage of her grandfather saying the same story twice in one afternoon. Captioned, "It started just like this." Because what AOC had done wasn't political, it was human. She had taken something millions had lived through, watching a loved one slowly become a stranger to themselves, and pointed out what no one wanted to admit. It might be happening again, not in a hospital bed, but in the Oval Office. And the people who had been pretending it was just a bad speech, or a long week, or the media being unfair, they were suddenly out of excuses. The comment sections began to fill, not with hate, but with grief, with fear, with stories, with the kind of messages that start with, "My mom used to," and end with, "We should have noticed sooner." And in every one of those reactions, from quiet shock to trembling courage, there was one thread running through. She asked what we were all afraid to say, and now, there's no going back. Alexandria didn't lean back in triumph. She didn't flick her eyes toward the cameras or look for validation from her colleagues. She simply nodded, once slowly, as though affirming something much older than the question she'd just asked. Her voice was measured, her eyes steady, and in the quiet that followed, she said not with fire, but with absolute conviction. "We have a duty to ask, not to hurt, but to protect." That was the moment the air changed, not just in the hearing room, but in living rooms, break rooms, and kitchens across the country. Places where people had long grown numb to political noise, but still understood the language of care wrapped in courage. No accusations, no theater, just 9 words that pierced straight through the fog of loyalty and fear. And before the next question could even be uttered by another lawmaker, the outside world had already caught fire. The clip, all 26 seconds of it, was uploaded by an intern on X with the caption, "Did anyone else just hear that?" It had under 200 followers. Within 10 minutes, it had over 100,000 views. By the time the hearing ended, major accounts had already picked it up. Cable networks interrupted regular coverage. TikTok creators stitched it with footage of stuttered speeches and confused moments, not edited to mock, but to mirror. Not to ridicule, but to say, "Look, we've all seen this before. In church basements in Atlanta and coffee shops in Denver, strangers looked up from their phones and murmured the same sentence. She didn't say his name, but we all know." AOC had done something almost no one in politics had dared in years. She treated the truth not as a grenade to lob, but as a responsibility to carry. She hadn't named names, but she'd held up a mirror that everyone recognized. And that was more powerful than any headline. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. Calm, grounded, like someone who'd watched a loved one decline and knew the pain of pretending everything was fine. The weight of denial, the heartbreak of delayed courage, the silence that followed her words wasn't empty. It was electric. The kind of silence that precedes confession, or collapse, or both. By the end of the afternoon, journalists were scrambling to get quotes from staffers. Political analysts were calling it a moment. But for the people watching from home, especially those with parents, spouses, or friends who had once been sharp, commanding, and slowly faded into confusion, this wasn't politics anymore. It was personal. And deep in the heart of the Capitol, as the hearing moved on like nothing seismic had just happened, there was one unmistakable shift. People weren't waiting for the media to tell them what to think. They were already thinking, already remembering, already wondering how long it had been like this, and whether the one voice who finally said it out loud, gently, clearly, unapologetically, might just be the one that changed everything. Inside the West Wing, the air was still, not the calm kind, The kind before a storm, when the temperature drops but no one knows what direction the wind is about to blow. Staffers moved slower than usual. Conversations had thinned to whispers. Phones buzzed, but no one picked them up without pausing first. There was a sensation crawling through the corridors. Something unfamiliar even to those who had weathered 4 years of chaos. Uncertainty without a script. In the communications bullpen, a wall of monitors had stopped flicking through the usual media cycle. Every single one now showed the same image. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sitting tall at the hearing, asking a single question. Then, silence. Then, there were moments. Yes. The clip looped again, and again, and again. No one moved. Nina Brandt, deputy press secretary, stood with her arms crossed, her mouth slightly open, eyes unblinking. One junior staffer finally spoke, breaking the room's paralysis. She didn't even name him. Nina answered without turning. And that's what makes it stick. Down the hall behind a closed door, the President of the United States sat alone, eyes locked on the same footage. The sound was up, then down, then up again. He'd replayed it more than 15 times, first with volume, then without. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't tweeting. That, more than anything, disturbed the aides waiting outside. The silence was louder than any of his usual outbursts. Trump watched himself not being mentioned, but exposed anyway. Not torn apart by opponents, but gently unwrapped by something far more dangerous than outrage. Compassion with a spine. He picked up the remote again, pressed play, watched AOC ask that same question, quiet but surgical. Then that man, that forgettable former aide, crumbled under the weight of a truth no one had prepared the West Wing to defend. After the 20th playback, Trump finally spoke. No one else was in the room, but the words came anyway, like he needed to say them out loud to believe they weren't real. "This is what we're doing now," he muttered, voice low. "We're talking about memory?" No one responded, but someone had heard him, one of his personal aides standing just outside. The phrase, "we're talking about memory now," spread through staff text threads within the hour. In the Roosevelt room, the communications team gathered around a screen and tried to draft a response. Someone suggested calling it a partisan stunt. Another said it wasn't smart to even acknowledge the hearing. Nina cut them off. She didn't attack. She asked a question, a calm one, and now we look like we're hiding. The problem wasn't just the clip, it was the tone. It didn't feel like theater. It felt real. And in a media landscape addicted to fireworks, something real, quiet, and honest had slipped past every firewall. The tension was thick, but no one dared say what they all knew. The public wasn't asking if it was true. They were asking how long everyone in this building had been covering for it. At the center of the silence sat the president, not outraged, not amused, not defiant, but still, remote in hand, watching the slow, surgical precision of a question he never thought anyone would dare ask. And somewhere inside him, whether he admitted it or not, he recognized something terrifying in that moment. She didn't come for him. She held up the mirror, and millions of Americans saw what they didn't want to see. In the deepest wing of the White House, behind 2 layers of guarded hallways and frosted glass, a private screening room sat in silence. The plush velvet seats, usually reserved for donor briefings or family-only film nights, now held a single figure, still, unmoving, and locked in concentration. Melania Trump sat alone, legs crossed, hands clenched so tightly on her lap that her knuckles had turned white. Her nails pressed half-moons into her palms, but she didn't notice. On the massive wall screen in front of her, the clip replayed for what must have been the 6th or 7th time. She wasn't watching the former aide's confession. Not really. She was watching the woman who made it possible. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Poised, calm, no edge in her voice, no accusations, no political venom. Just a single question, and that was what made it unbearable. Melania's breathing was shallow but controlled. Her eyes didn't blink often. She looked less like a spectator and more like someone trying to remember something, or maybe trying to forget. An aide finally entered through the side door, cautious, careful not to startle her. Ma'am, he whispered, the car is ready. St. Mary's is expecting you by 2:45. Melania didn't respond. He waited. Do you need a few more minutes? I'm not going. Her voice was low, steady, not angry but final. The aide hesitated. He'd never heard her say that before. Not once in the last 7 years had she skipped a public commitment without a detailed statement, makeup prep, or calendar management. Should I let them know you'll be late or... I said cancel. She didn't raise her voice, but it was the kind of command that left no room for echo. Cancel everything. The aide nodded slowly and backed out of the room, leaving her once again in the glow of a screen she couldn't stop watching. Melania wasn't reacting to politics. Not in the way pundits on TV would later spin it. This wasn't about protecting the image of a party or shielding her husband from criticism. This was something deeper, something closer to the truth that lives behind closed bedroom doors, after press conferences end and advisors leave. Because she'd seen it too. Not once, not twice, but enough. Enough to know that the voice on that screen wasn't making noise. It was pressing on a bruise the country had pretended wasn't there. And maybe that's what cut the deepest. AOC hadn't called Donald unfit. She hadn't mentioned his name. She hadn't mocked or accused. She had simply asked the kind of question that only someone who understands the slow erosion of dignity would dare to ask out loud. Melania felt a strange ache in her throat. Not sorrow, not rage, but recognition. And that frightened her more than anything else. She thought of the St. Mary's fundraiser, the cameras, the flashing lights, the reporters calling out questions she no longer cared to answer. What would she say if they asked her about the hearing, about the clip, about the growing whisper that maybe, just maybe, something was wrong? She had no answer, not one she could live with. So she stayed in that darkened theater, watching a congresswoman she once dismissed now peeling back a truth that no one else had the courage to name. Watching not the words but the silence that came after them, the silence that said more than any press release ever could. And for the first time in years, Melania didn't have a plan. She had instinct, and it told her that this wasn't going away because the country wasn't watching a performance anymore. It was watching itself, and it was starting to remember. It was 6:02 a.m. when the world stopped pretending. No press release, no official statement from a spokesperson, no polished graphic or brand-colored banner. Just a single unfiltered post from Melania Trump's personal X account, written with none of her usual detachment or polish. The timestamp was raw, the wording even rawer. Speaking about a man's health without facts is shameful, not brave. No tagging, no hashtags, no further clarification. And yet within minutes, the country was ablaze. Cable shows cut into their morning weather reports. Editors at major outlets scrapped their planned headlines. Influencers, doctors, veterans, and housewives were reposting the message with their own captions, ranging from sympathetic to scathing. Some read it as a defense, a wife protecting a husband. Others saw something darker, a last-minute attempt to smother a fire that had already consumed the curtains. But beneath the noise, behind the punditry, there was a deeper tension brewing. Because for all her claims about facts, Melania never denied the question AOC had raised. She didn't name Alexandria. She didn't reference the hearing, but no one needed her to. The subtext thundered louder than any all-caps headline could. People weren't asking whether Melania supported her husband. That was obvious. They were asking why she'd chosen now, after days of silence, to speak, and why she'd chosen to use words like shameful and brave, which only gave Alexandria's moment more weight. By 6:19 a.m., Melania was trending across every major platform. So was AOC, cognitive, and the question. Not even 24 hours had passed, and the clip from the hearing, once treated as a footnote, was now being reframed as a reckoning. In New York, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was already awake. She didn't post anything. She didn't need to. Her team understood that when someone has struck a nerve that deep, the most powerful move is to not react. Instead, she sat by her kitchen window, tea in hand, scrolling through the explosion online with a kind of calm detachment. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't strategizing the next move. She was watching the very thing she had warned about. not in a speech but in the tone of her question, finally surface in public discourse. Because Melania's post, intended or not, had done something irreversible. It had validated that this was more than politics. It was human. It was personal. It was real. And it proved something AOC had long believed. The most dangerous truths aren't the ones shouted from podiums. They're the ones spoken softly, in rooms where no one expected history to unfold. Across America, people who had ignored the hearing the day before now raced to watch the clip. They didn't watch it for drama. They watched it with a kind of reverent curiosity, trying to understand what they had missed. And what they found was something that didn't feel partisan. It felt familiar. In nursing homes, in veterans' halls, in families whose memories had blurred with age or trauma. The moment hit not as a political strike, but as a mirror. And for many, Melania's attempt to silence the conversation only made it louder. By mid-morning, editorial pieces began asking the unthinkable. Was AOC the only one brave enough to ask what others whispered behind closed doors? And suddenly, the narrative wasn't about a single congresswoman from the Bronx. It was about whether the nation itself had been complicit in a silence too long kept. Melania may have meant to draw a line, but in the softest hours of the morning, she drew a circle. And AOC, without a single new word, stood firmly inside it, unshaken. The hearing may have ended in a quiet chamber on Capitol Hill, but its echo didn't stop at the steps of Congress. It reached living rooms, kitchens, classrooms, hospital waiting areas, and VFW halls, places where truth isn't debated for airtime, but felt in slow heartbreak. In a modest brick home outside Columbus, Ohio, a retired public school teacher sat in her worn recliner beside her husband, coffee cooling in her hands. The early morning news was replaying Melania's 6:02 a.m. post when the segment cut to the now viral moment. AOC's voice, measured, respectful, unyielding, asking whether the former president ever gave an order, only to forget it hours later. The teacher didn't blink. Her husband noticed the way her grip tightened around the mug. "That's how my father started," she whispered. "He didn't forget people. He forgot time, forgot where he put the keys, then forgot why he picked them up in the first place." Her husband didn't respond. He didn't need to. The silence in the room had more weight than either of them could hold aloud. Across the country, in a sun-drenched apartment in Miami, a young veteran of Afghanistan was sitting alone, scrolling through headlines with one hand and rubbing his temple with the other. He'd watched enough congressional posturing to be numb to most of it, but something about her tone, not the words themselves, made him freeze the clip and watch it again and again. "She didn't call him unfit," he muttered half to himself. "She said what we've all seen, and we were too damn scared to say it." On a bus in San Diego, a single mom played the video on her phone with her son listening beside her, earbuds split between them. When the clip ended, the boy asked, "Mom, does that mean he's sick?" She didn't answer right away. What could she say? That maybe it was possible. That sometimes the strongest men are the last ones to admit they're losing their grasp. That sometimes power clings hardest when it knows it's slipping. That AOC wasn't being cruel. She was being careful and brave. In countless homes, the conversation turned from political analysis to personal reflection. People who had buried loved ones to dementia, who had lived through the fog of caregiving, who knew the horror of watching someone fade behind their own eyes. They didn't hear a congresswoman grandstanding. They heard themselves. In Tennessee, a pastor pulled up the video for his Bible study group and asked the room, "What if truth is uncomfortable because we're supposed to sit with it, not run from it?" In Arizona, a conservative grandmother who'd never voted Democrat in her life wiped her glasses slowly and said, "That girl, she didn't want to humiliate him. She wanted to warn us." And somewhere deep in the Midwest, a teenage girl typed a comment on the reposted clip. She spoke like someone who lost someone and didn't want the rest of us to lose more. The video, once treated as a niche moment, now held millions of comments, many not political at all. They were about fathers who forgot birthdays, uncles who wandered off during family reunions, war heroes who stared blankly at medals they once earned. This wasn't just about Trump anymore. It was about America, a country afraid to talk about aging, afraid to admit decline, terrified of what it might mean to question the mind of a leader, especially one who had commanded headlines for years with brash certainty. But here was a woman, AOC, who didn't accuse or insult. She asked, and by asking, she cut through every layer of noise and ego and fear, landing in the one place politicians rarely reach, the human heart. In the span of 48 hours, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had gone from quiet congresswoman in a routine hearing to the woman who broke the silence a nation didn't know it was holding. It wasn't the viral clip that broke Melania's silence. It wasn't the trending hashtags, the commentators shouting on split-screen panels, or even the White House aides pacing nervously outside her residence with briefing folders they knew she wouldn't read. It was something quieter, something older, a memory, not even a week old. They had just returned from Camp David. The air still smelled of pine and burnt cedar, the kind Melania always associated with awkward photo ops and rooms full of people pretending to laugh at his jokes. She had slipped off her heels, walked past the East Wing corridors, and turned to find him in the hallway. "Donald," she'd said casually, "did you want to go over your notes for the Taiwan briefing tomorrow morning?" And he had looked at her, eyes narrowed, mouth tight, and asked with a tone so casual it felt like ice water on the spine. "What meeting?" At the time, she'd brushed it off. Maybe he was tired. Maybe the schedule had changed. Maybe he was just being difficult. Again. But now, sitting alone with a tablet in her lap, the AOC clip frozen mid-frame, Melania wasn't brushing it off anymore. Because Alexandria hadn't accused. She had asked, not with a prosecutor's voice, but with the kind of cadence you use when you already know the answer, and you're just hoping someone else will say it aloud first. Melania played the clip again. This time she didn't watch AOC's face. She watched the witnesses, the tremble in his lip, the pause that took a second too long, the eyes flicking to the lawyer, not for guidance but permission, and the quiet, devastating words. There were moments. Yes. It was like watching someone peel back wallpaper in a perfectly manicured room and reveal the water rot underneath. Melania's fingers tightened around the edge of the couch cushion. "She said it like she cared," she whispered, "not like the others." That was the part no one was talking about. They were focused on the implications, the politics, the damage control. But Melania had spent more years than she cared to count watching people circle around her husband like vultures. Some afraid, some opportunistic, most indifferent. But that woman, AOC, had looked disturbed, not gleeful. There was a difference between exploitation and confrontation, between gossip and concern. And for the first time, someone had chosen the harder road, to ask the question that could make her a target, not a hero. Melania hated weakness. She had been raised to see emotion as vulnerability, to value control above confession. But even she knew what fear in the form of denial looked like. And right now, her husband's empire, his staff, his donors, his followers, were feeding him just that. Pity in disguise, loyalty with strings, fear pretending to be respect. And yet the person who'd dared break the silence wanted no credit. That was what burned deepest. AOC had asked one question, left the room, said nothing else, and the world had shifted. Melania looked out the window. The sun was coming up over the city. The White House was awake again. Gears turning, PR teams typing, headlines forming. But inside her, for the first time in years, a different engine had started. Not rage, not defiance, clarity. She didn't want sympathy. She wanted reality. And reality, whispered gently in a congressional hearing, with no cameras at first, had found its voice. In a Bronx-born congresswoman, speaking not with fury, but with love disguised as courage. The morning after the clip ignited every screen in America, AOC's inbox looked like a media war zone. National anchors, European bureaus, podcasts with millions of subscribers. Even Oprah's team sent a quiet inquiry. Everyone wanted the same thing, a follow-up, a soundbite, a headline, preferably with her face front and center. But Alexandria didn't answer. She stood in her district office, windows open to the hum of Bronx traffic, watching her staff try to keep up with the chaos. A junior aide nervously approached her desk with a folder of interview requests and said what everyone was thinking. This could change everything. You just have to speak. But she shook her head. Calm, firm, already decided. The question was enough, she said. Let the silence speak. And then she turned back to the pile of constituent letters that hadn't stopped coming in since she took office. Birthday wishes, rent complaints, notes written in shaky Spanish or angry block caps. Because the work hadn't changed. The storm was outside, but in her world, the ground stayed steady. She hadn't asked that question to score a clip. She'd asked it because it had sat in her chest for months, unspoken. She'd watched the footage. She'd seen the hesitation in briefings. She'd seen America pretending it didn't notice. And now that the question had been asked, something unusual was happening. It wasn't just progressive allies reaching out. It was names that made her assistants pause and reread the screen. Republicans, independents. Even a senator who'd once mocked her in public now called her office and asked quietly to talk. Not for a quote, not for strategy, but for something they couldn't admit out loud. Respect. Because when she stepped back from the spotlight, they saw it for what it was. Not modesty, but discipline. Not retreat, but power withheld. And that made it louder than any televised takedown. And still she refused the parade. When her team urged her to go on cable to clarify, she said, I was clear. When they asked if she'd do a statement to control the narrative, she replied, the truth doesn't need spin. But what she didn't say, and what only her closest staff could sense, was the storm brewing behind her stillness. Not fear, not regret, conviction. Because she understood something the media didn't. Real change doesn't begin with outrage. It begins with doubt. With the first moment someone at home leans forward and says, wait, is this happening? And that moment had already arrived. So while the press hunted for drama and social media chased outrage, AOC did the unthinkable. She stayed quiet. Because silence, when held with purpose, becomes its own kind of thunder. And in that quiet, the phone kept ringing. Not from journalists, but from lawmakers who had never before looked her in the eye. From constituents who had once rolled their eyes when she spoke. From Americans who now whispered to their children, that's how leadership sounds. They were listening not just because of what she'd said, but because of what she refused to say next. And by saying less, she'd said everything. The voicemail didn't come through official channels. No capital protocol, no legal preamble. Just a blinking red light on the front desk phone in AOC's field office. Buried beneath a pile of unrelated casework. No name, no caller ID, just a timestamp, 2:43 a.m. Her staff nearly deleted it, assuming it was another rant, but something, maybe the scratch in the voice, or the pause before the first word, made them stop. They forwarded it to her private line. She played it once, then again, then let the silence swallow the room. This is going to sound strange, the voice began, but I worked in scheduling at the White House. Camp David weekend. Last fall. You need to know what happened. He thought it was a COVID meeting. It wasn't. AOC sat perfectly still, not angry, not surprised, just sharper. The voice was slow, deliberate. It didn't shake like a confession. It hovered like someone unpacking a burden they'd carried alone for far too long. He arrived late, no coat, hair not combed, asked where Dr. Fauci was, said he had new China documents to share, but the room was full of budget aides and military staff. He'd been briefed. We were there to finalize base closures. But he wouldn't sit down. He looked lost. Another pause. Longer this time. I kept waiting for someone else to say something, but no one did. They just pretended it didn't happen. Even the chief of staff looked away. AOC leaned back, staring through her window as Bronx sunlight crept over rooftops. This wasn't about scandal. This wasn't a gotcha. It was something heavier, sadder, something that made the breath in her lungs sit still like held truth. The message ended simply, I don't want money, or press, or protection. I just want someone to know it happened, because I saw what you asked, and I knew someone had to answer. The line cut. No callback number, Just a quiet, anonymous soul who had seen the same thing AOC had, and finally found the courage to whisper it. She didn't rush to the press. She didn't summon legal counsel or schedule a hearing. Instead, she called her assistant and said, "Find me every log of that weekend. I want every staffing note, every digital trace, every internal itinerary. If the story is true, there's a trail. And if there's a trail, we don't follow it with fury, we follow it with purpose." Because this wasn't about attacking a man, it was about naming a silence. And it started with listening. In that moment, something shifted, not just in her, but in the story itself. What began as a spark in a quiet committee room was now a slow, gathering wind. The kind that doesn't knock down doors, but opens them. AOC didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply closed her laptop and whispered, "Tell me everything." The meeting wasn't on the calendar. There was no location listed, just a coffee stain on a Post-it note, passed like a relic through a chain of junior aides who'd learned long ago that the truth in Washington doesn't travel on letterhead. It moves in whispers. AOC entered the private room tucked behind a chapel bookstore, not with fanfare, but with the quiet determination of someone who'd stopped expecting courage from headlines. Inside sat 6 people, 3 staffers from opposing offices, 2 mid-level White House retirees, and 1 sitting Republican senator who wore his discomfort like a press suit, crisp, controlled, but deeply creased underneath. They didn't exchange greetings, only nods. Everyone here had something to lose. The senator was the first to speak, his voice low but unsparing. "We've all seen it. We've just been too afraid to say it aloud. You weren't." AOC didn't reply. She just waited, not with the silence of passivity, but the kind that invites confession. A young aide opened a leather folder and slid it across the table toward her. It wasn't typed, no digital breadcrumbs. Just pen on paper, uneven, scratched handwriting, the kind made by someone watching the clock instead of the room. Inside, records from Camp David, doodles in the margins, repeated phrases like China tapes, names circled, then scratched out. A note from 10:17 a.m. that read, "Why is Mike not here? We agreed. Mask policy today." Mike Pence hadn't been part of that weekend at all. There were corrections made after the fact. Different pens, different pressure. But the original notes told a fractured story, one that couldn't be undone by edits or talking points. One aide, previously with the communications team, leaned forward. "The narrative changed every Monday. We'd be told the meeting was about foreign policy, but the footage showed discussions on hurricane relief. He'd mix up hurricanes with riots, states with senators." Another voice joined, this one shaking but resolute. "I once had to pull briefing cards for the same topic 3 days in a row. Same folder, same subject. And every time, it was like he was seeing them for the first time." AOC flipped through each page slowly, absorbing not just the content, but the human cost it implied. Not one of these individuals looked thrilled to be here. No one here wanted a scandal. They wanted release, from the guilt, from the gaslighting, from the fear that silence made them complicit. She didn't ask them why they waited. She already knew, because the machine around power is built to deny the rust until the bolts fall off in front of the cameras. She placed the folder down gently and said what no one else dared to. "This isn't about taking him down. It's about lifting up the people who will pay the price if we pretend everything is fine." That sentence didn't make headlines, but it echoed. Through the room, through every eye that met hers. They had come to a crossroads not of politics, but of responsibility. And for once, it felt like someone had the steadiness to walk it without flinching. As the meeting ended, no one applauded. No one embraced. But a second folder was passed, this time thinner. Inside it, names of others willing to talk. One line was scribbled on the back in pencil, barely legible, but enough to leave AOC staring at it for a long, quiet moment. She's not just asking questions, she's documenting the silence. And that silence, it had just begun to crack. It wasn't a White House line. It wasn't even her staff's phone. Melania Trump stood by the third-floor window of Mar-a-Lago, a silk curtain half drawn in her hand like a shield. In the distance, a rain cloud hovered just offshore, threatening the blue sky with a storm that hadn't yet arrived. The same way the truth had hovered in her home for months now. Maybe years. She dialed the number from memory. No aids, no schedule, just instinct. The line rang once, then again, then a click. "Dr. Keller," came the voice. Warm, familiar, like an old photograph you don't remember framing. There was a pause, a hesitation. Then Melania's voice, quiet but firm. "I need you to tell me the truth, not the report, not what the staff reads to him at night. The truth." There was silence, then a sigh, the kind that carried weight, not from fatigue but from restraint, the sound of a man who had once sworn to heal bodies, not bury secrets. "Melania," he said, his tone shifting from protocol to personal, "you already know it. You've been carrying it longer than I have." She closed her eyes. The breeze from the open window rustled the hem of her blouse. "He forgets where the door to the briefing room is sometime," she said, more to herself than to him. "He thinks he's already given the speech. He says, 'Let's go home,' when he's standing inside it." She didn't cry, not then, but her voice cracked. The kind of fracture that comes from holding up a building alone while pretending the beams weren't rotting. The doctor didn't interrupt. He knew the difference between grief and guilt. "You told me he was tired," she added, "that he needed rest. But you knew it wasn't just exhaustion. You saw the slips, the repetitions, the gaps." Dr. Keller cleared his throat gently. "When I first raised concerns," he said, "I was told to monitor, not to document. Then I was told to frame, not to clarify. When you live in proximity to power, the diagnosis becomes political, but biology doesn't negotiate." Melania stared at the ocean. The words frame and clarify weren't medical. They were media terms, manipulations, damage control wrapped in professionalism. She suddenly remembered a moment last month. Donald had handed her a folder upside down and smiled, as if waiting for her to thank him for it. Inside were press clippings from 2017. "He still thinks Pence visits every Thursday," she whispered. "Mike hasn't been near him in months." The line went silent again. Then Dr. Keller spoke with a heaviness that made her stomach turn. "You're the only one he trusts who isn't pretending. You're not protecting his image. You're protecting his memory. What's left of it." She felt it then. Not anger. Not even grief. Just something more dangerous. Clarity. The realization that in trying to shelter him from the truth, they'd built a castle of denial, and the foundation was already cracking. "If I ask you to come see him," she said, "not as a doctor, but as someone who saw him before all this, would you?" There was no hesitation. "Yes." Melania ended the call but didn't move. The wind had picked up outside. The storm was closer now, and for the first time in years she didn't try to close the window. She just stood there, letting it in. The Tampa sun had barely set, but the air inside the rally tent was thick. Part humidity, part tension. Supporters packed shoulder to shoulder, waving red hats and homemade signs. A band had just finished playing "God Bless the USA" for the second time that evening, and the anticipation in the crowd had shifted from electric to strained. They wanted their punchline. They wanted him. And then Trump emerged, swaggering with that familiar smirk, one hand raised in salute like he was brushing off doubt with every finger. The crowd erupted, but not with the same fury as before. This wasn't 2016. This was something different. Older, heavier. He approached the mic and started strong. "They said we couldn't win Florida? Well, guess what? We won it by so much they had to recount just to make the loss look respectable." Laughter. Cheering. That line had worked for months. And then, without missing a beat, he said it again. "They said we couldn't win Florida. Well, guess what? We won it by so much." The repetition landed awkwardly. Some chuckled politely. Others exchanged glances. A few phones dropped slightly, their owners too startled to keep recording. Trump's eyes blinked twice, then again. He looked right, then left, as if searching for a cue card that had never existed. His fingers gripped the podium tighter. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The sentence had vanished. "We," We're doing great things, he finally mumbled, almost inaudible. Great things. But the silence had already replaced the cheer. It wasn't dramatic. It was worse than that. It was slow. The kind of slowness that everyone feels, but no one wants to admit aloud. Like watching someone you know fumble for a name you both should remember. Then from the wings, movement. Melania. No introduction, no announcement, no teleprompter. Just a quiet entrance, her heels hushed by the felted stage floor. She walked calmly, deliberately. Her hand landed on his back. Not in force, in guidance. She leaned in close, whispered something the microphones didn't catch. And then, without resistance, he nodded. He followed. The crowd didn't boo. They didn't chant. They didn't do anything. Because they knew. Behind the curtain, staffers scrambled. One aide turned pale, whispering, "Do we cancel Ohio next week?" Another called for the medical team, not with panic, but with procedure. Like a drill they'd quietly rehearsed but prayed they'd never need. And in living rooms across America, phones buzzed. A clip already posted to Twitter. Trump freezes mid-speech. Melania intervenes. A caption already trending. He forgot. Again. But it wasn't the media that broke the illusion. It was the moment. The hush. The aching recognition. And somewhere in a small office in the Bronx, AOC sat watching the live stream alone, her jaw tight. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't post a reaction. She simply whispered, "There it is." Because for weeks, she hadn't needed to scream the truth. She just asked a question, and now the answer was playing out. Not in a headline, not in a hearing, but in front of thousands of supporters who had once laughed, now stunned into silence. It wasn't politics anymore. It was reality catching up, and it had finally stepped on stage. Across living rooms, bar counters, and break rooms, the country didn't just witness a moment, it studied it. News outlets, weary of being accused of spin, chose a different tactic this time. No voiceovers, no talking heads, just footage. 2 screens, side by side, split clean down the middle like a mirror cracked by time. Left, Trump in 2016. Brash, brutal, bulldozing his way through sentences. Right, Trump last night in Tampa, pausing, blinking, repeating himself. Stumbling over a joke he'd told 10 seconds prior. There were no arrows, no red circles highlighting his expression, just the raw contrast of who he was and who he is now. The silence between sound bites said everything. On Twitter, hashtags began to swell. Hashtag then and now, hashtag truth hurts, hashtag she asked first. Clips were clipped again, not to isolate but to contextualize. From conservative outlets to centrist platforms, the tone wasn't accusation anymore. It was concern. It was recognition. Something had shifted. The mask wasn't slipping. It had been gently removed by reality. And the comment sections? They didn't explode in rage. They filled with something deeper. Grief, confusion, clarity. "This isn't politics anymore," one user wrote under the CNN repost. "It's a plea for someone to notice what's happening." "I didn't vote for her, but she asked what no one else would," said another, on a thread under MSNBC's broadcast. That takes guts. Even Fox News, usually quick to defend, chose a quieter approach. They simply played the rally footage, uncut, no pushback, no framing, just the feed. And in the silence that followed, the anchors didn't laugh. They didn't excuse it. They just moved on. Because what could be said? And at the center of it all, the question. AOC hadn't made a claim. She didn't launch an attack. She asked something everyone had been afraid to ask. Were there ever moments when the president seemed confused, within hours of giving an order? It wasn't designed to destroy. It wasn't even pointed. It was humane. It was surgical. And now, days later, that question echoed louder than any campaign slogan or supercut ever could. In classrooms, teachers used the footage as a case study in truth versus spin. In nursing homes, residents watched with their adult children and nodded, slowly, painfully, because they had seen this before. Not in politics, but in their fathers, their sisters, their spouses. The same pauses. The same reaching for a word just out of reach. The same soft spiral. Meanwhile, AOC remained quiet. No tweets, no interviews. When asked for comment, her team simply said, "The Congresswoman believes the American people are watching and thinking. That's enough." And it was, because the conversation was no longer about partisanship. It was about capacity, about responsibility, about love for the country and even for those we disagree with. And while some clung harder to their narratives, others, millions quietly, began to shift. Not out of betrayal, but out of honesty. Because truth, once spoken softly, has a way of rising on its own. And in that truth, something extraordinary was unfolding. America wasn't shouting. It was listening, not just to the clip, but to her. 3 days had passed since the hearing, 3 days of absolute silence. No posts, no interviews, not a single word. While the media argued clips got chopped and twisted and tweets fired off like sparks, AOC vanished from the news cycle. But that silence didn't dull her presence. On the contrary, it made the nation lean in closer. Then on a quiet Thursday morning, as America was still reeling from the Tampa rally video, a single clip, just 38 seconds long, dropped on AOC's personal account. No filter, no studio lights, just a simple frame. Her behind a desk, no heavy makeup, natural light falling softly across her face. Her voice wasn't loud, wasn't meant to shock, but every word landed like a hammer striking steel. Cold, direct, undeniable. "We're not enemies," she began, "but we are responsible." That question wasn't cruel. It was overdue. 3 sentences. That was it. But they cracked the air open. Within 15 minutes, the phrase #overdue question began trending. Not because it was catchy, but because deep down, everyone knew. This was something they'd been avoiding far too long. A teacher in Michigan wrote, "I wish someone had asked that when my father was still alive. Maybe I would have handled things differently." A doctor in Georgia commented, "This isn't politics. This is humanity, and the courage to face what no one wants to admit." AOC's post wasn't just a return to the conversation. It was a return to a standard many thought had died. That leadership isn't about speaking louder. It's about daring to say what no one else will. Her office received more than 12,000 emails in 24 hours. Hundreds of phone calls, some from people who had never supported her. But now they weren't calling to debate. They were calling to say thank you. Thank you for not turning cognitive decline into a punchline. Thank you for not calling for collapse, but simply for asking. People rewatched the original hearing clip again and again. On the second, third, fifth viewing, they noticed what they hadn't the first time: the witness's hesitation. AOC's subtle nod after his answer. Not the kind of nod that says, "Gotcha," the kind that says, "I know, and I don't hate you for it." Cable hosts were suddenly at a loss. Some tried to spin it as strategy, but viewers didn't care. They weren't sharing the clip because it was tactical. They were sharing it because it felt like someone had finally said what they couldn't put into words. And in this wave of reposts, debates, and quiet awakenings, one truth emerged. AOC didn't need to name anyone for the entire country to feel the name. She didn't have to raise her voice, because when truth already lives in people's hearts, all it takes is one person brave enough to whisper, and the whole nation will listen. The morning light in Mar-a-Lago barely reached the corners of the breakfast room. Outside, the palms swayed lazily in the Florida breeze. Inside, the air felt like stone. Melania stood at the threshold, her coffee untouched, her hands cold. Across from her, Donald read a briefing he didn't understand. Or maybe he did. But the way he kept scanning the same page said otherwise. She took a breath, then another. And then she asked, softly but firmly, like a line drawn in sand, "Do you remember the meeting with the veterans last Thursday?" Donald didn't flinch. He looked up, chest out, voice practiced. "Of course I do." He even chuckled, like she was the one who had forgotten something. His usual confidence, the armor he wore so well, clung to him like a stubborn shadow. But Melania didn't blink. "You never went," she said. The room stopped breathing. Even the clock on the wall felt like it hesitated. Donald's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" We had it after lunch. I thanked the wounded warriors. It was... Melania stepped forward, her voice lower now. Not quieter, but sharper. There was no meeting, Donald. You were in the residence all afternoon. I was the one who told the staff to cancel it. Silence. It was the kind of moment that, once it happens, redraws your whole reality. A small, intimate confrontation. No reporters, no cameras. But it was more devastating than any headline could be. Because this wasn't about politics anymore. It wasn't about power or polling or press spin. It was about truth, and whether a man who once commanded nations could now no longer command his own memory. Donald opened his mouth, searching for something. An excuse, a shift in subject, a change of ground. But for the first time, Melania saw it. Not the bluster, not the denial, but the fear. He genuinely didn't know he hadn't gone. That truth, that quiet, horrific truth, settled over her shoulders like ice. It wasn't a gotcha. It wasn't victory. It was a kind of heartbreak that didn't scream, but whispered in a language too familiar. He's slipping, and no one is willing to say it. Melania didn't lash out. She didn't storm off. Instead, she sat down across from him, folded her hands, and asked the question no one in that inner circle dared voice. Do you ever wonder what you don't remember? He said nothing, and in that silence, she knew. Not because he answered, but because he couldn't. This wasn't a scandal waiting to explode. It was a tragedy unfolding in plain sight. And what haunted her most wasn't that the country might soon see it. It was that they already had, and too many were pretending not to. Hours later, alone in her private suite, Melania replayed the moment again and again. Not out of cruelty, but because something had shifted. The man who once prided himself on being untouchable had just revealed the one thing he couldn't outrun: time. And somewhere in the background, still echoing across media feeds and family dinner tables, was the voice of AOC. Not accusing, not mocking, but demanding honesty. The kind of honesty that doesn't humiliate, it liberates. The kind the country wasn't ready for. Until now. It started in corners, quiet rooms, late-night texts, no press briefings, no podium speeches, just unease taking root in unexpected places. In the cloakrooms and elevators of Capitol Hill, the same words kept surfacing. Did you see that hearing? She didn't even say his name. By the time Monday arrived, the whisper networks weren't whispering anymore. They were organizing. Staffers from both sides, some cautiously, some defiantly, began reaching out across party lines. It wasn't about allegiance anymore. It was about duty, about whether anyone in this building still had the courage to say what needed to be said. For weeks, some had tried to convince themselves it was politics, a stunt, a viral moment engineered for the spotlight. But AOC hadn't gone on a media tour. Now, she hadn't tweeted a thread or called for resignations. She had done something far more dangerous. She'd left the silence intact, and that silence was now deafening. In one particularly tense hallway meeting, a moderate Republican from the Midwest leaned in and said to a colleague, "It's not about party anymore. It's about clarity. We're making decisions based on someone who might not even be fully present." The response was quiet, a nod. No outrage, no spin, just a shared recognition that the ground was shifting beneath their feet. That afternoon, a senior Democratic aide walked into AOC's office with a folder. Inside were drafts, early versions of a proposed resolution, nothing punitive, nothing inflammatory, just a call for medical transparency from sitting officials with access to the nuclear codes. "We want you to lead this," the aide said. AOC didn't look surprised. She had felt it coming. Not just the political swell, but the moral obligation. Still, she took her time before answering. She looked out the window where the Capitol dome cast its long shadow across the city. Then she turned and spoke, not like a politician seizing momentum, but like someone setting boundaries for history. "I'm not here to remove. I'm here to remind." The aide furrowed their brow. "Remind who?" AOC smiled, thin and serious. "Everyone. That this government doesn't belong to any one man. It belongs to the people, and the people deserve the truth, not because it's easy, but because it's theirs. The words weren't defiant. They were surgical. She wasn't playing chess. She was holding a mirror, and the reflection was getting harder to ignore. By nightfall, Hill reporters caught wind that something was brewing, meetings being scheduled, resolutions being passed around, names that normally wouldn't appear in the same inbox suddenly doing just that. But no one could quite pin it down. No leaks, no press kits, just a rising sense that history wasn't waiting for permission. And while others were scrambling for statements or denial or damage control, AOC stayed at her desk, fielding calls from constituents, veterans, teachers, nurses, each with a story, a personal version of the bigger truth. One woman from Arizona said, "When my dad started slipping, it was like watching a light flicker. You want to believe it's still steady, but deep down, you already know." And that, AOC thought, is why this matters. Not because it's convenient, but because it's human. That night, she didn't write a tweet. She didn't rehearse a speech. She wrote 3 words on a sticky note and placed it on her monitor. Compassion demands clarity. Tomorrow, the resolution would take its first breath. It wasn't a campaign event. No lights, no live stream, just a dusty flyer posted in a deli window near Astoria Boulevard that read, "Town Hall, Thursday, 7 p.m. All welcome. No RSVP, no fanfare. Just folding chairs in a community hall with paint peeling at the edges of the ceiling and the smell of old coffee soaked into the carpet." AOC stood at the front. No staffers hovering. No podium either. Just her, a rickety mic on a stand, and a cluster of neighbors in plastic chairs that creaked when they shifted. They were old teachers, retired sanitation workers, war veterans, single moms with questions. These weren't pundits or donors. These were the people who don't speak on camera, but carry the weight of the country on their backs. She didn't bring slides. She didn't bring applause lines. She brought silence first. The kind of silence that says, "This matters." Then she spoke. "If you wait too long to say something," she said slowly, clearly, "someone else pays the price." There was no reaction at first. Not because they didn't hear her, but because they did. A Vietnam veteran sitting in the back row blinked hard and looked down, his weathered hands folded over a baseball cap. A nurse next to him nodded slowly, eyes glassy, like someone who'd had to say he's gone one too many times this year. AOC didn't try to perform. She wasn't there to go viral. She was there because she knew what it felt like to sit with something too long, to carry questions you're afraid to ask because the answer might shake everything. And now the whole country was carrying that weight. She had only said what everyone else already felt, but that somehow had become the bravest act of all. There's a difference between disrespecting a person and demanding transparency from a position, she said. One is personal, the other is national. An older woman in the third row leaned forward. "Why'd you have to be the one to say it?" she asked. AOC looked her in the eye. "Because I was the one in the room, and silence doesn't age well." Someone in the back started recording on their phone. Not for clout, but for truth. The clip would later circle online, subtitled by strangers in 3 languages, racking up millions of views. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. A young man in a hoodie raised his hand. "What if they come after you now?" he asked. She didn't flinch. "They already have," she said. "But if we're too afraid to speak when the moment comes, we're not preserving democracy, we're embalming it." That landed like thunder, not loud, but deep. You could feel the room exhale as if they'd been holding their breath since the first whisper of decline was denied. AOC shared no private memos. She didn't leak names. What she gave them was heavier, responsibility. She reminded them that their power wasn't in their title but in their voice, that the point of democracy isn't to protect the powerful, but to hold them accountable. Lovingly, bravely, and without delay. "We didn't get here overnight," she said, "but we won't get out unless we walk out together." As the chairs scraped the floor and the crowd began to rise, someone handed her a folded note. "You weren't cruel. You were the first one honest enough to be scared out loud." That sentence never made the news, but it stayed in her pocket. By the next morning, a video from the town hall had gone viral, not because she slammed anyone or dropped a bombshell, but because she didn't hide. She told the truth not as a weapon, but as an invitation. The caption on one repost read, "She didn't say what was easy, she said what was overdue, hashtag truth over comfort." And that night, in a community hall with no press and no spotlight, America's loudest question was finally asked in a whisper. It wasn't broadcast, no press pool, no flag backdrop, just a quiet room, a mahogany desk, and a single woman who had spent years watching power from behind a pane of bulletproof glass. Melania didn't speak often, and when she did, it was usually scripted, filtered, and ironed of feeling. But this time was different. There were no advisors, no PR handlers, just a folded page, handwritten, tucked inside an envelope with no seal. It wasn't addressed to the nation or even to her husband. It was addressed to truth. She left it at the front desk of the Atlantic's DC bureau. No signature, no return address, just 7 words. Every leader deserves truth, even when it hurts. That was it. By the time the editors verified the source and published it, it was already circulating on Capitol Hill like contraband. Screenshots on locked phones, printouts left on desks, text messages sent in fragments. Some thought it was fake. Others knew instantly it was real. Real because it said what the country had refused to admit aloud. Real because it didn't scream. It confessed. Inside the White House, aides scrambled. Some demanded it be denied. Others stayed quiet, afraid of confirming what had already slipped through too many cracks. Melania didn't clarify. She didn't retract. She didn't post a photo in defiance or offer a quote to soften the blow. She simply went silent. But silence in this case spoke louder than loyalty. Republicans who had scoffed at AOC's question just days earlier now shifted uncomfortably when asked to respond to the former First Lady's words. Democrats didn't gloat. They didn't have to. The truth wasn't partisan. It was just finally undeniable. Cable networks tried to spin it. Was this a betrayal? One anchor asked, but the public knew better. This wasn't a stab. It was a release. And maybe, just maybe, it was the first honest sentence Melania had been allowed to say in years. In Queens, AOC didn't comment. She didn't retweet the leak. When asked about it by a journalist outside her district office, she simply replied, "Truth isn't always loud. Sometimes it just lands." And it did land, like thunder underfoot. Because when someone who's been silent for so long finally says something clear, the world pays attention, not out of curiosity, but out of recognition. It was as if Melania had been holding her breath for 8 years and finally decided to exhale. What made the sentence hit wasn't its length, it was its weight. Every leader deserves truth, even when it hurts. Some read it as an indictment, others read it as a cry for help. But to those who'd been paying attention, those who saw her hand on his back in Tampa, those who heard the whisper to the doctor, those who watched the doubt grow behind her carefully painted smile, it was something else entirely, a reckoning. The kind that doesn't need volume, the kind that breaks chains without shattering glass, the kind that reminds you power is hollow if it refuses the mirror. In nursing homes, veterans circled the line in newspapers. In classrooms, teachers used it to start civics discussions. On TikTok, teenagers posted it over lo-fi piano tracks. Everyone interpreted it their own way, but no one could ignore it. And perhaps that was Melania's point, not to ignite a fire, but to stop pretending there wasn't already smoke. In a world where statements are measured in clicks, here was one that asked for nothing and gave everything. No hashtags, no branding, just raw, undressed truth, dropped like a stone into the still water of denial. And the ripples were only beginning. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't storm the room. She didn't insult or provoke. All she did was ask the one question that had been sitting in the marrow of a nation too scared to face itself. And when that question dropped, quiet, measured, undeniable, it landed like thunder. She didn't shout. She didn't blame. She asked the one question no one dared, and when the silence fell, America finally heard itself. That's the thing about truth. It doesn't need volume. It just needs a spine. AOC's words didn't come wrapped in rehearsed sound bites. They weren't made for clips or campaigns. They were born from responsibility, raw, deliberate, and necessary. And as the silence stretched across newsrooms, living rooms, comment sections, and congressional offices, it spoke louder than any outrage ever could. In that moment, we weren't Democrats or Republicans. We were witnesses to a line finally drawn, to a question finally asked, to a country finally pausing long enough to consider. What happens when leadership becomes illusion and silence becomes complicity? AOC didn't drag anyone. She didn't demand resignations. What she offered was scarier: accountability, not just for one man, but for all of us. And the internet didn't explode. It exhaled. Hashtags didn't scream. They echoed hashtag overdue question. Because in every home, someone has waited too long to say something that mattered. And in every silence, someone has paid the price. That day, she reminded us that real courage isn't about performance. It's about precision. And that the most powerful thing you can say in a broken room is the truth. What struck me most about this story wasn't the politics. It was the silence. AOC didn't humiliate or grandstand. She did something far rarer. She created a pause long enough for the nation to hear what it's been trying to ignore. That takes courage, not just in Congress, but in everyday life. How often do we sense something's wrong and say nothing? This reminded me, leadership isn't about volume, it's about precision. And sometimes one quiet question can break through years of noise. Real power doesn't roar. It cuts through the room without raising its voice. Have you ever stayed silent only to regret it later? Or did one soft sentence ever change everything? Let us know below. And if this hit you like it hit me, there's more coming. You won't want to miss what happens next. If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.